Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. On October 1st, Iran launched its most intense ballistic missile attack on Israel to date, firing approximately 200 ballistic missiles in 1 hour at a state the size of New Jersey. This attack was one of the largest, if not the largest, ballistic missile attacks in history. This all comes in response to the Israeli-targeted killings of prominent leaders, Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh and Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah. Despite the scale of the attack, Israeli and U.S. air defenses rose to the challenge, minimizing infrastructure damage and limiting casualties. Only one fatality was reported during the barrage, a Palestinian man in the West Bank town of Jericho. However, the situation on the ground was far from quiet. Just moments before the missile strike, 2 gunmen carried out a deadly shooting in Jaffa, killing 8. In the aftermath, Iran's foreign minister issued a stark warning to Israel, saying any retaliation for the missile strikes would be met with even stronger retribution. Over the following days, Iranian officials have stated that any Israeli attempt to target Iranian infrastructure would be seen as a red line. At the same time, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and other Israeli officials made it clear that Iran will pay for this attack of 200 ballistic missiles. However, the extent and nature of the response remain to be seen. The stakes couldn't be higher. With Israel successfully striking major blows to Hezbollah, the jewel of the Iranian ring of fire of proxies, Israel is likely to seize this moment as a potential turning point for the region. To discuss this critical juncture, I'm joined by Ray Takeyh. Ray is a senior fellow of Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing on Iran, U.S. foreign policy, and the modern Middle East. He has written extensively about Iran in the region, most recently publishing a book entitled The Last Shah and the Guardian of the Revolution. Prior to coming to CFR, Ray served as a senior advisor on Iran at the U.S. State Department. I am joined also by Meir Litvak. Meir is a professor at the Department of Middle Eastern and African History and director of the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and is currently a visiting professor at Georgetown University. His main area of expertise is the relationship between religion, society, and politics in modern Iran. He also studies the interface between nationalism and religion in the Muslim Middle East, with a special focus on the Shia. He has written extensively on these topics. Ray and Meir, welcome to Decision Points.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Delighted to have you both, 2 Iran experts. I want to start, as I try to do, to set some context to our discussion, to give us a sense of our listeners to understand the origins of the enmity of this regime towards Israel. It seems odd to many. Iran has no territorial border with Israel. There's no territorial dispute because it's 1,000 miles away from Israel, over that. And yet the Iranian regime has repeatedly called for wiping Israel off the face of the map, and the words of Ahmadinejad, the former president, but it's repeated by others. Rhetorically, you could say, why at every meeting do they have to yell, death to America, death to Israel? What's the connection to anything? And if it was just rhetorical, it'd be one thing, but there seems to be a whole infrastructure. The Al-Quds forces of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's dedicated against Israel. We did a whole episode called Ring of Fire about Iran's relationship to its proxies. We've also done an episode and doing another one on Hezbollah and can it be revived? But it's hard to understand, where did this all come from for someone who's not so knowledgeable? Give us some context to is it an ideological commitment to the destruction of Israel, or is it other factors? Explain the depth of the regime's enmity towards Israel. Ray, let me start with you.
Well, you mentioned there is no territorial dispute between the 2 countries, but there was also an alliance of sorts between them during the monarchy that lasted until 1979. The short answer to your question is that there's a deep strain of anti-Semitism that runs through, to be frank, the clerical community. And the opposition to the state of Israel actually began in the seminaries even before that, before the idea of Jewish immigration into Palestine and the displacement of the Muslims and so forth. So there was always a sort of an ideological opposition to the state of Israel and to the Jewish community as it came to Israel, expressed through Islamic religious lexicon. And of course, the founder of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, was deeply hostile to Israel. If you take his most important publication, his blueprint for Islamic government, called Islamic Government, in the introduction, he attacks Israel. Paragraph 3, I believe. He doesn't wait to chapter 1. He starts early. And actually, that has metamorphosized into an entire conspiracy proposition, whereby this amorphous thing called the Jewish community controls the United States. In a way, the United States itself is a victim of a Jewish conspiracy, while also enabling the state of Israel at the same time. It is seemingly disconnected intellectually, but somehow it comes together. And of course, that has been the foundational ideology of the Islamic Republic, as an aspect of this ideology, probably one of the most enduring aspects of it. And you see it all the way from early 20th century all the way to today, including the speech that Ali Khamenei made, I believe, last Friday, where his theme was, again, the close connection between the United States and Israel, expressed in the typical conspiratorial terms. And of course, the expression of all this ideological animus has been support for non-state actors, terrorists, proxies, militants, and so forth. And you see this enmity continue. This particular hostility, this manufactured hostility, it doesn't help Iran. It doesn't help Israel. It doesn't help the people in the region. But it has persisted because of the ideological commitment of the state.
What's amazing, Ray, is the Arab Sunni states that, went to war with Israel 48, 67, 73, some went to war in 56. At least on the state level, they have found ways, some of them for accommodation. But the Iranians, it seems, it's unabated. Is this instrumentalist in a certain way that the Iranians say, in terms of vying for leadership of the Muslim community around the world, this is our way to outflank the Arab states from the right, that our enmity is unabated while they have found their ways for accommodation?
That probably features into it, although I don't know how that benefits Iran. I don't know how that benefits the economy of the country. It's ideologically satisfying, but I'm not sure if practically beneficial. To put it in those terms is to suggest a measure of pragmatism. The idea that this is a power contest with other Arab states, so in order to displace them and appeal to their population, you embrace anti-Semitic slogans. There probably is an added benefit of that, but I think they really mean it when they utter the slogans. And they would do so even if that puts them at a strategic disadvantage, which I think in a lot of ways it does.
So explain that point, how it's put them at a strategic disadvantage, how it's been a liability to the regime over the decades.
Well, this unrelenting hostility toward Israel, which expresses itself in form of terrorism usually, has created a sort of international coalition against Iran. It has led to sanctions applied to Iran, which has drained its economy for 40 years. It has prevented its oil from reaching all the relevant markets. It has retarded its trade with the Europeans. It has ostracized it in the international community to some extent because of its Holocaust denial and having Holocaust conferences, annual cartoon festivals about the best anti-Semitic imagery and depiction. None of this is not soft power. This is offensive. It's an affront to international sensibility. But, as I said, when they're so ideologically committed to something, so I think it has led to sanctions, it has led to ostracism, it has led to some sort of a regional antagonism toward them, with Arab states increasingly wanting to step away from this conflict. And it has led, as we have seen to some extent, to one of the more disturbing and aggressive wars in the Middle East, starting on October 7th. It has led in some way to a humanitarian situation that we see today.
Meir, over to you. I wonder, do you see it similarly, that it's really unrelenting, this enmity? It's driven, it goes back to the Ayatollah, it's foundational. This is not just over time, it's a kind of a rhetorical lip service. How do you see it?
Well, let me say, I agree in very many things which Ray said, but I want to elaborate a little bit. It is indeed deeply ideological. It is, I would say, an essential, almost central element in the ideology of all modern Islamist movements. Sunnis and Shias, and in Iran. Anti-Jewish sentiments existed in the Shia clergy 100 years ago, but indeed Khomeini was, I would say, a rabid anti-Semite from the early 1960s. There's a lot of evidence. The point I want to add is that for them, anti-Zionism is the culmination of two struggles, two wars in which the Muslim world is engaged. One, it is the culmination of a supposed Jewish war against Islam that had originated in the times of the Prophet Muhammad. And I agree with Ray. In the first page of Khomeini's book, he says, from its inception, Islam was inflicted by the Jews because the Jews conspired against Islam. In a way, Zionism is the culmination of this Jewish conspiracy against Islam. By the way, sometimes they use anachronistic terms when they say that the Prophet Muhammad, when he destroyed the Jewish tribes of Medina, he destroyed Zionist bases, as if there was Zionism in the 7th century. At the same time, modern Islamism regards itself as being under cultural, economic, and political offensive by the West. From them, the West is the number one enemy because Western culture, the Enlightenment, is the greatest threat to Islam. All Islamist movements, and by the way, other anti-Semitic movements, associate the Jews with the West. In a way, the Jews are the most violent manifestation of the West. And Khomeini speaks about a Western Jewish alliance against Islam that wants to destroy Islam and prevent Islam from fulfilling its divine destiny. Zionism is simply the meeting point between this Jewish war against Islam and the Western, from going back to the early days of Islam, and the Western Islam. So yes, it is deeply ideological. In my view, again, it's an essential element of Islamist ideology, and this is why it is so difficult to remove. At the same time, here I have a little disagreement with Ray. I think Iran believes that it benefits from its enmity toward Israel. They have a problem because they are Shia and most Arabs are Sunnis. They are Iranians, again Arabs. They believe, partly correctly, that enmity toward Israel will also serve them to build the bridge to the Muslim or to the Sunni Arab majority. At the time, it was partially successful. At other times, it failed. For instance, when there was a civil war in Syria, Muslim brothers were infuriated against Iran, but Iran does believe that it benefits them. Now, I fully agree, by the way, it does not benefit the Iranian people or the Iranian economy. It benefits the Iranian regime. It is not only Ahmadinejad. Khamenei, the current leader of Iran, is an anti-Semite, even though he denies it. He uses terms which, the international interest lobby and international finances, which speaks about, which really are code words for Jews. Khamenei speaks incessantly about the need to eliminate Israel. I would say that anti-Semitism is deeply ingrained in the official discourse of this regime, borrowing elements from European anti-Semitism, the blood libel, protocols of the Zion, and other things, and also from mixing them with Islamic terminology. Again, I believe the Iranian people does not benefit from this policy. The Iranian regime certainly believes that they benefit from it, and for them, this is a worthy price. By the way, I genuinely believe that they hate America, not only because of Israel, but because of American culture, which for them is a major threat to their ideology and their worldview.
But you see continuity, you would say, from the Shia pre-revolutionary past of Iran before the Islamic Republic. You see more continuity, or do you think he's deepened it? Clearly, he's created apparatuses that didn't exist before the regime, but ideologically, you see continuity more than discontinuity.
Undoubtedly, the 1979 revolution marks a major change because now anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism becomes an official policy, and it's been expanded tremendously. Again, not only given state coverage, but the entire clerical establishment is mobilized. Let me give you an interesting example. There was a study done by the Tony Blair Institute several years ago. They analyzed speeches by Khomeini and Khamenei. Anti-Israeli statements or Israel appeared in 40% of Khomeini's statements, but it appears in 90% of Khamenei's statements. That is, Khamenei is much more obsessed about Israel. And let me say there's another interesting and problematic development in my view. In recent years, I have observed an attempt to present the Jews as enemies of Shia Islam, as if the Jews were responsible for the predicaments and tragedies that had befallen upon the Shia from their inceptions. In a way, by the way, it is an attempt to get closer to the Sunnis by exonerating most of the Sunnis from the early sins of their ancestors and by shifting the blame to the Jews. So it is the Jews who played a key role in depriving Ali of his succession, and the Jews played a key role in other tragedies that befallen the Shia. This is a new development, very problematic in my view.
people need to understand Khamenei. What you both have been saying about the ideological animus that he has personally. We hear that he had a very close relationship with Hassan Nasrallah, that some even said he was one of the closest people to the Ayatollah. To what extent does the personal have an impact here? Or do you think that Khamenei is colder, he has a worldview, and this is more instrumentalist in terms of his relationships with Nasrallah, or is that deepened the enmity? Or you say, look, he's so off the charts, it doesn't really matter?
I believe that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is genuine, and I think Khamenei is, as I said, obsessively anti-Zionist. By the way, he works with a kafia, with a Palestinian kafia, to show his solidarity with the Palestinians. Yes, Hassan Nasrallah was very close to him, and so was Qasem Soleimani. He cried, I would say, deeply when Qasem Soleimani was killed by the Americans. I think for him it is something which he deeply believes in, and so the personality does count. Now, to give you another example, by the way, take former President Rouhani. Now, Rouhani was part and parcel of the Iran regime, okay? By the way, many loyal person. But Rouhani certainly was never a Zionist. But Israel did not have such importance for Rouhani. Rouhani stated in 2015 that the real problems of Iran is not the US nor Israel. It is corruption, it is poverty, it is the droughts, etc., and for which he was vilified. So yes, personality does count to some extent. Rouhani had other problems. He understood that Iran had more urgent problems than Israel, and he wanted to address these problems. Khamenei is different.
Ray, over to you. I want to now just say about the Abraham Accords in 2020, and now all the talk about Israeli-Saudi normalization. President Biden has weighed in on this himself. He thinks October 7th was done, I don't know if he said it at Iran's behest, but certainly to slow it down or thwart it if possible, the regional normalization. Are you saying, look, they're driven by ideology. The fact that it serves them regionally to thwart any sort of Israeli-Saudi normalization, that's just a bonus, but it's not central to them. To what extent do they see October 7th and beyond, whether they were part of the planning of it? We could have a whole discussion, but certainly in the subsequent period, to what extent is it part of a regional calculation? Or you say, look, it's not about that. They want to make Israel unlivable, period. And so people have left the south of Israel, and they've left the north of Israel, and Israel says they're going to bring back to their homes. But, Iran thinks this is part of a wider plan that way. Now, I realize they might not be mutually contradictory. Both could be true. But anyway, I was just wondering how you saw October the 7th in Iran's, like a regional calculation or not.
Well, how does Ali Khamenei, as was mentioned by Professor Litvak, routinely calls for extinction of Israel? It routinely calls for it. But how is it going to be done? Actually, when he elaborates on that, he suggests that there'll be gradual pressure on Israel and people, the best and the brightest, will leave. Israel will be more degraded economically, unlivable, and therefore you'll see an exodus from it as this pressure comes across on different fronts. That rhetoric actually predated October 7th. And so October 7th in a way fits into that. In terms of the geopolitics of this, it is the Iranian rhetoric that suggests since October 7th, again, Ali Khamenei, who gives a lot of speeches, as part of his speeches, he always says that regional states should abhor dealing with state of Israel that's committing these particular crimes against its neighbors. That all forms of relationships that have been constructed with Israel should be discontinued. So he does use the idea of war in Israel and its neighbors as a means of calling for a sort of a political and strategic boycott of Israel. And so in that sense, October 7th helps toward a potential strategic realignment that would be disadvantageous to Iran. Although I think we sometimes exaggerate what intimacy Abraham Accord and its successors would create, but no doubt the region was realigning itself in a manner disadvantageous to the Iranian public. So, what role did October 7th play in terms of the Iranians asking or being part of the planning? Honestly, I don't have the answer to that question. All I know is in the summer of that year, there was a lot of Hamas delegations going back and forth in Iran. There was a lot of attempts by the Iranian military officials to coordinate between their proxies, particularly Hezbollah and Hamas, in terms of operational planning. Was that a prelude to an attack? I don't know, but there was a lot of traffic between the two states. And Hanifa, who was killed in Tehran, actually, at one point gave a conference saying, hey, we received $70 million from the Iranian government in terms of missiles and so forth. So there was an attempt to bring the proxies closer together. There was a great degree of, at least public display of conferencing between Palestinians and others. They seem to have been operational planning, but did they know about October 7th ahead of time? Honestly, I don't know.
No, I mean, it's clear that, Nasrallah and other leaders spoke publicly about in the summer of 2023 that Israel's at its weakest point because of the judicial overhaul debate in Israel, which they followed. And Nasrallah was always proud that he was an Israel watcher.
That debate within Israel, and I don't really look at the Israeli press, I look at the Iranian press, the judicial debate was highlighted. And also when they were proclamation by reservists saying, I'm not going to serve here or there, that was also highlighted. So I don't follow the Israeli press, but this is what I saw from the Iranian press reporting on the state of Israel.
No. This is all consistent. I mean, does Iran, though, believe if it wanted to, it could thwart Israeli-Saudi normalization? And do they see it as an anti-Iranian regional alliance?
My guess is that's probably the way they saw it. And it's not an unreasonable surmise, by the way, to suggest that these very different countries are coming together because of shared enmity. I mean, Israel is a democratic state, Saudi Arabia is most distinctly not. So for this alignment of very different political systems to come together, it has to be some shared strategic objective. And that shared strategic objective is obviously, to some extent, dealing with the threat that Iran poses. Now, Iran has two ways of approaching that. Number one, to diminish the threat it poses, and essentially engage in some better relationship with its neighbors, or to essentially try to thwart that by a variety of its non-state actors engaging in activities as we saw.
And Meir, how do you see it in terms of Iran seeing that the normalization is something that should be thwarted? Or like, look, when it came to the Emirates and Israel, they didn't try to block the Abraham Accords. What we're hearing is they passed messages to the Emiratis saying we're not going to try to block it so long as there's not an Israeli military base on Emirati soil.
I agree that thwarting the Abraham Accords is one element, but I fully agree, by the way, with what Ray had said. Khamenei spoke about the need to wage war of attrition against Israel from the 1990s. Okay, it has got nothing to do with the Saudis. And this was Iran's strategy. By the way, it should say Iran using Arabs to fight its wars, to spare its own troops. Preparations for the attack against Israel began long before any Saudi-Israeli talks about rapprochement or some sort of alliance. Israeli-Saudi rapprochement might have been a catalyst, but certainly not the reason. Now, they did in the past warn the Emiratis that committing a major mistake, and this was a foolish mistake, and, they will pay for it, etc. But there's a difference between, Saudi Arabia is not only a much bigger Arab state, more important, it is also the place, the controlled city of Mecca and Medina. It has an important Islamic position. And certainly if the Saudis would become closer to the Israelis, that's a blow to the Islamic front. Now, there's also another point. Saudis are not only Sunnis, but they are formerly Wahhabis. Not the current crown prince, but if you look at the Saudi system. And you cannot eliminate the deep animosity between Wahhabis and Saudis and Iranians, even though there was an attempt of rapprochement. Let me just give you one example. If you look at Iranian discourse, they say that the Wahhabis were created by Jews, that the founder of Wahhabi Islam, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab from the 18th century, had in fact Jewish ancestry. And the Saudi royal family, by the way, is supposedly descended from the Jewish tribe of Banu Qaynuqa in the 7th century Medina. So with the Saudis, there's also, I would say, the deep religious animosity toward the Saudis that added to it. But again, October 7th, the idea of an attack against Israel was prepared long before Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. I agree, by the way, that apparently the Iranians were not aware of the date. The prevalent estimate in Israel is that Sinwar did not inform the Iran simply for security reasons. He was afraid that it would leak. But for the preparations, the strategic preparations, obviously, if you look at the amounts of weapons, and as Ray said, delegations, etc., and a joint headquarters in April 2023 established in Damascus under the auspices of Hezbollah, that's obviously that Iran is deeply involved in these efforts, except the date.
I do think there's one more piece that relates societally that you two could both shed great light for our audience, and that is the role of another figure, the new president of Iran, Pezeshkian. Conventional wisdom is the presidents are not important when it comes to some key foreign policy decisions like Israel, that this comes from the supreme leader Khamenei himself. He's the man who counts. But I do want to know, to what extent does his emergence tell us something broader about where Iranian politics, Iranian society is going? Is this a relevant data point that we need to grapple with in terms of understanding how Iran might respond in any crisis if this keeps going back and forth in terms of missile retaliation and the like? So the role of society, how it's changing. We keep hearing about the disaffection. We kept hearing about the protest movement of women and things like that, that it seems that the regime is kind of squelched. What do we need to know about someone who's come from outside the political elite? In his case, he's a surgeon, I believe. But of course, you don't get to be the president of Iran if you don't identify with the regime. I think we have to be clear about that. Ray, how do you see the role of society and the dynamics in terms of its trajectory? What should we know?
Well, in terms of society, I would argue that the Iranian society today is not revolutionary. Revolutions don't take decades to unfold. But you have a sort of internal attrition going, internal stalemate, in the sense that the public, by large measures, would like to have a representation in government, accountability, and a different foreign policy, and the government obviously is not willing to give them that. And you see periodic flare-up of this tension. So Iran today is perhaps not convulsive, but the situation is corrosive. There's been a massive defection of the elite, which each uprising, a segment of the elite gets purged from the body politic. Ali Larijani today is outside the boundaries of acceptability in the Islamic Republic. Hassan Rouhani, former president, is now turned into a dissident. One of the most scathing critics of the Islamic regime comes on his website, Aftaba News, Sunny News. So Islamic Republic has a way of turning establishmentarians into dissidents, but not necessarily revolutionaries. These are all distinct categories. So the regime confronts a sullen population, and it will continue to deal with outbursts of opposition, as we saw with Women Life Freedom Movement. It has an apparatus of repression that, in my opinion, has been tested, but not tested to the degree that the regime was in 1979, but that may be coming. The degree of dissatisfaction and disaffection from the regime today pervades all the relevant classes, working classes, middle classes, whatever, upper classes. So it's an explosive situation, and it continues to grind down the Islamic Republic's popularity to the extent that it has any legitimacy, which to the extent it has any. So it's the internal situation is very disruptive. Dr. Pezeshkian was chosen for his role. Remember, in March, when he registered to be candidate for parliament, he was rejected. 3 months later, he was accepted for the presidency. So what you have with Dr. Pezeshkian, I think Ali Khamenei, who constantly tinkers with the system, thought he brings in a figure of some purported moderation that actually tranquilizes the society. Because one of the things that the genius of the Islamic Republic is by giving the impression that through electoral process, you can register your grievances. You know, Rouhani is different than Ahmadinejad. Khatami was different than. So you have choices. And those choices, the political system was not offering people any choices anymore. Pezeshkian is designed to kind of revive that particular pillar of stability for the system. And I think he's been a fairly effective figure in one sense that he doesn't seem to be disruptive like Rouhani was. He talks about national unity government. He talks about bringing conservatives in. Iranian presidents matter, they always have. I think today, in the situation we have in the Middle East, he's probably less relevant simply because he doesn't have the experience, he doesn't have the background. Hassan Rouhani was deeply enmeshed in Iranian security services. He was a secretary to the Supreme National Security Council longer than anybody in history of that country. I mean, he was well known to the security organs. If you notice in the past crises that the Islamic Republic has experienced this year, the attacks on Israel and so forth, Ali Khamenei has chaired the Supreme National Security Council himself. Statutorily, that's the job of the president. Ali Khamenei gets 2 representatives to the Supreme National Security Council, but he's not the chair. So he actually has absorbed and taken over those functions. I say Dr. Pezeshkian has an international function for the regime as well. He represents an interlocutor for the West. His principal competitor, Saeed Jalili, he just scared the horses. He scared the gazebos out of the Europeans. I mean, he was an ideologue with an ideologue's integrity. He was raw and real, and too real. He was too nuts for the Raisi administration. Apparently, there was a flaw. Pezeshkian, who came to New York and talked about opening the dialogue with the United States. And I think that dialogue is likely to be taken up by whoever becomes the president in the administration after November. So he essentially offers the international community an interlocutor of purported moderation and authority. So he has both the domestic role and an international role. I think the domestic role, in that sense, Ali Khamenei exaggerates to what extent Pezeshkian can tranquilize the society, because what ultimately caused the repression of the women life freedom movement was the regime's cruelty. And I want to be very specific about this. One of the things that the regime did was poison school kids. If you recall, at that time, suddenly school kids across the country were being poisoned. Female school kids, because the schools are segregated. The problem that the Islamic Republic had in repressing the women's freedom movement is the 16-year-old girls that they were arresting were defiant. They didn't know how to deal with them. They were defiant. They didn't respect them. They didn't know how to deal with them. So it's a clever, cynical, and cruel thing that the Islamic Republic did by poisoning school kids was they enlisted parents in the apparatus of repression. What they said was, we can't control your daughter, but you better, because otherwise she's going to get poisoned in school. So they essentially conscripted parents in the attempt to repress their children. And I want to highlight this because it's one of the most despicable, cruel things I have seen, and I think I've seen a lot. But that's how they control the society. And Pezeshkian is there for it to stay calm. To me, this is an explosive situation that will bubble up again, because that kind of a cruelty is very provocative. People have long memories. 4,000 or 5,000 school kids were poisoned. 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds. Paradoxically, there were no fatalities, I think, maybe few. And one of the things that that episode highlighted to me is that the regime doesn't trust its foot soldiers. Because to engage in this kind of poisoning, you need a small number of people in your Ministry of Intelligence. Every day when the conscripts were going to the streets and some young woman was taking her headscarf off, they didn't know what to do with that. And that was essentially affecting the morale of their troops and their online forces. This is in many ways still conscript armies. They relied on a different way of controlling the population, which to me is one that will rebound to their disadvantage in the long term.
Okay, Meir, I want to ask you to follow up on the societal theme. Prime Minister Netanyahu has publicly stated more than once recently that Israel does not want to harm the Iranian people. Some wonder if this is going to mean a focus in the retaliation on military targets and symbols of the regime and avoiding things like infrastructure that affects society writ large. We don't know. We're in the middle of this crisis and not at its end. Do you find the Iranian public is tuning in to what the prime minister said? Or you say, look, their views on Israel will take a long time to change. Don't expect a sudden change. Or people tend to rally around the flag during crises. Or, as Ray says, these deep-seated fissures of alienations are such that any crisis of missiles, this is bound to exacerbate the growing chasm between Iran and its people.
I want to follow up and add to one of the 2 points which Ray mentioned, which I think are very extremely important. There is clearly growing alienation between the vast majority of Iranians and the regime. I think there is a nucleus of about 20, 25, or 30% of people who support the regime ideologically or because they benefit from it, and there's growing alienation of the rest of society. I think many people in Iran, especially among the youth, don't care about Israel. They may not be pro-Israeli, but they don't care about Israel. They have more important things to think about, and some of them, I think, are sympathetic to Israel because the regime is hostile to Israel. And you can see it, by the way, there was a very important, significant video clip showing how students on the entrance of Tehran University make an effort not to step on the American-Israeli flag that has been drawn on the ground so that every person who enters the university would step on them. They were made a tremendous effort not to step on it as defiance against the regime. Now, I believe this has an impact. And here I think the role of Pezeshkian is a little bit of importance. I fully agree that Pezeshkian is not very influential. He was brought in as a remedy, as a tranquilizer, etc. But yes, Khamenei makes the decision, but Pezeshkian is the voice that simply says, we can't go into a major war because we have economic problems. Another point, I think the Iran regime understands that unlike the 1980s when Iran was attacked by Iraq and then the people rallied around the regime, people volunteered to fight and sacrifice themselves, this is no longer the case. I think they're aware of it, and that makes them more cautious. Not moderate, but cautious. They know that if they initiate a war, the people may not necessarily rally behind them. It may be different, again, here I don't know, and I cannot speak with certainty, that if Iran is attacked, then patriotism will prevail. Again, provided people will feel that, again, the regime is attacked, not Iran as a state, not the Iranian people, and not Iranian national honor. Now, how many of them believe Netanyahu? I really don't know. I'm not sure that Netanyahu is very popular in Iran or has, again, much respectability. And therefore, I think it is important not to alienate the Iranian people, not to humiliate the Iranian people, so that they will not follow the regime. I fully agree with Ray that social base of the regime is narrowing down. If you look at 1979, it was a very broad coalition that brought the Shah down. Gradually, historically, they removed partners, and now even within the clerical system, it is one section within the clerical system that remains in power. The others have been marginalized, suppressed, and a regime with a narrow base of support has to rely more and more on repression instead of sympathy. In the long run, it makes such a regime more vulnerable. The economic situation in Iran is not great. There's tremendous mismanagement and corruption. I agree that time does not bode well for the system. I don't know how long it will take, but I fully agree that they face problems, they are aware of it, and this makes them more cautious. At the same time, it is still a successful repressive regime and very brutal.
Do you both think regime change is likely in Iran, and over what period of time? If you had to have your crystal balls, do these clashes with Israel make it more likely, less likely, or it's irrelevant? Meir, what do you think?
I think that eventually this regime will change because, again, it is alienated from most of society. Iran undergoes important social, cultural processes that go against the regime. By the way, Iran also faces some very acute challenges from the ecology they are not addressing sufficiently, and that will pose major problems for them. However, I'm pessimistic in the short run because I think that for the time being, the regime is secure out of a combination of several things. One is very successful, effective, brutal repression, fear among many Iranians that Iran will plunge into a civil war like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, fear that they may face a military dictatorship of the IRGC, which will be worse than the current regime, and lack of organization, lack of leadership. These things help the regime. At the same time, historically, if you look, many revolutions came as a surprise. No one expected in 2011 that Mubarak would be toppled. By the way, not many people expected in 1975 that the Shah would be toppled. So we may be surprised. By the way, I hope we'll be surprised. I hope I am wrong. I think, again, time works against this regime. It weakens this regime. It may either be toppled or, by the way, it can degenerate. If you think about the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, that became an ossified, ineffective system. Maybe this is what will happen to Iran. And in many ways, by the way, I see similarities between current situation in Iran and the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. Iran has huge oil reserves. Iran has to import gas for its cars. Iran has the second largest reserve of natural gas. Iran has to import gas from Turkmenistan. There are electricity shortages in Iran because of mismanagement. This is something deeply problematic in this regime. Either the regime will, again, become ossified, ineffective, or it will be toppled, but I cannot say, I don't dare to guess.
Ray, what do you think about regime change in Iran? How far away, if you had to say, and do these kinds of things of clashes with Israel, does it strengthen the regime, weaken the regime? Are there things that Israel could do that might have an impact on weakening a regime that it clearly sees as very hostile and as the United States sees as very hostile to American interests?
I agree with all of what was said. I want to focus on Ali Khamenei's brilliance of maintaining this system, tinkering with it, playing with it, maneuvering it. That's the kind of dexterity that is difficult to replicate. It's like trying to replace LeBron James. You can't look to the bench and say, hey, one of you guys come in here, score 27 points, 15 rebounds. It's hard to do that. He's the kind of a LeBron James of that system. I don't see anybody on the horizon that can manage all that with the adroitness and dexterity that he has whenever he expires.
I mean, Gorbachev, right? Didn't Gorbachev come in thinking he could preserve the system?
Yeah.
And then he came to the view that it couldn't be preserved. But he wanted to tinker in a way that would maintain a very ossifying regime. People talk about Khamenei's son. Does he share his father's same enmity?
I don't believe the Islamic Republic does dynastic successions. If they do so, go to his son, that reflects how far they have moved from the original revolutionary idea of egalitarianism and so forth. They don't do dynastic succession. So I'm not quite sure where the succession process is. I'm sure they're thinking about it and may even have essentially chosen somebody in the background. But it'll be difficult to maintain the system. I think one of the themes of Ali Khamenei's speeches historically, beyond anti-Semitism, which is a big part of it, is the experience of the Soviet Union. It's the understanding that a despotic regime like this lives on tyranny and lives on repression. One of the things that baffled the Shah when the revolution, when the uprising broke out, he was surprised as how unpopular he was. I don't think Ali Khamenei is surprised by his unpopularity, and they don't care about it. The purpose of the Islamic Republic is not to be popular, but to gain divine approbation. And last time I checked, nobody ever came down and said it doesn't have that divine approbation. Nobody has disputed that claim. So in that sense, it is indifferent to some extent to his population's grievances, but it cannot remain completely different because of the explosive situation. I'm not sure if there's anybody in the political scene that I see at this point that can manage the system with the same degree of effectiveness and adroitness and imagination, and it will require all that. Now, to your question, war with Israel. For a long time, I believed that one of the reasons why the Islamic Republic may have been cautious because it feared a war with an adversary with superior firepower at the time when the situation was domestically unsettled. So they may be a little more at ease with their domestic situation. But I do think it behooves all the intelligence services and anybody who's analyzing this situation to look at the April bombing, the missile launch that Iran did, 300 projectiles. It was intended to be a mass casualty event. Something happened that April that hadn't happened in 45 years. Why did they make that decision? Who was involved in that decision-making process? Who was for it? Who was against it? What did they think would happen? Were they prepared for retaliation? Because they were obviously trying to kill a lot of people. They didn't launch an operation for it to be unsuccessful. So the question therefore becomes, why did in April 2024 the Islamic Republic cross a line that it had not crossed before? It usually used proxies and surrogates to attack Israel. Why did it decide to do so on its own? Why did it decide to launch 300 projectiles in order to kill a large number of people, knowing that that would provoke a retaliation? Because that means, David, the regime is in a different place today. It's much more brazen, it's much more risk tolerance, it's much more aggressive. And so it may be miscalculating its position internally, but essentially we need to understand that decision better. And I don't at this point. I think Israeli intelligence services and others need to really think about this.
It's exactly where I was going with this. And Meir, maybe you could help. If you look what happened in April, and now you add what happened on October 1st, an estimated 200 ballistic missiles fired within an hour on a state the size of New Jersey. I don't think there's anything comparable to this in the world today. And after all that, one person is killed. It happens to be a Palestinian in Jericho. How does Iran internalize this? And how does the public see those two strikes? Do they see them differently? And Ray's point, about what are the lessons from all this? Here you've done these 2 rounds with virtually no casualties. What's the lesson for Iran? What's the lesson for the Iranian people?
I would make a distinction. I think the Iranian regime is probably pretty satisfied with the attacks. First of all, they proved to themselves that they can do it. They proved to the world that they can do it, they're capable. I agree, by the way, this is a major event. The threshold has been crossed that would be very, very difficult to go back to the previous situation. First attack, by the way, they targeted a military base with the intention, by the way, not to kill civilians, because I think they want to send a message to Israel, stop, as a warning. Israel did not listen, it retaliated, and then Israel whether we continue by killing Haniya and then punishing Hezbollah. I'm not sure that the Iranian people are aware of the limited success of these two attacks. Now, the Iranians, by the way, can comfort themselves that the Israelis could stop. The damage was not that great because, well, okay, the Israelis were assisted by the American Air Force, by the British Air Force, even the French. So Israel by itself could not face Iran. It needs the support of other countries. So maybe next time we'll be able to inflict more damage on Israel. Again, I have no idea how people in Iran view it as a success or failure. Suppose if the regime believed that, yes, Iran showed its capability and punished the aggressors, my guess is that, again, most Iranians don't want war, that most Iranians don't want Iran to be involved in a major war. And this is, by the way, the regime is afraid of a major war. The problem is this is a very fine line, and that you may find yourself in a war which you do not necessarily intend to get because of what you do to the other side.
Can I just say one thing about this? The night when the 200 ballistic missiles were fired, the Revolutionary Guards issued a statement that 80% of them have hit their targets. The next day, Abbas Araqchi said 90% hit their targets. Today, it's probably 110. So that's one way you deal with it. Second of all, this is a very serious situation for the Israeli government. The Iranian regime has offered the following proposition. Anytime they don't like what Israel is doing in the region, they reserve the right to attack it with ballistic missiles. Imagine the following. If Canada attacks the United States with ballistic missiles, anytime it doesn't like America's policy in Central America. Who does this?
Right, exactly right.
I think the Israeli government has entered a new phase of conflict with Iran, and it must address that in a manner that moves the threshold back to at least where it was, where Iranians were relying on surrogate powers. They should not be allowed and given immunity to attack the state of Israel with ballistic missiles every time they don't like what's happening in Gilo.
Exactly. Well, that's my last question for both of you, which is really, like I said, we're at a disadvantage. We're in the middle of this crisis and, we can't see beyond it yet. I mean, it's clear that Israel has said it's going to retaliate. The United States has backed it. It's certainly hitting military targets. We haven't really talked about the nuclear program. And, you could say maybe this is one big distraction for the Iranians, that they keep going on the nuclear thing. They think they'll be, already some might call it a threshold nuclear state. There's a presumption that they're so close that it might have a deterrence effect on everyone around them. Others say, look, there's the nuclear piece, but there's a question of, are we at the beginning here, the U.S., or certainly there in Israel and the Iranians, in some sort of war of attrition where Israel retaliates and then it goes back and forth and back and forth. I'm trying to think about how to look at the trajectory of this crisis. I realize it's hard because we're in the middle of it right now, so it doesn't make it easy. But the impact of this crisis on the Iranian nuclear program, does it speed it up? Does it slow it down? Of course, you say, well, if Israel hits the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, that has an impact directly. Others will say, well, no, Iran will take a year or two. Israelis might say, yeah, that's what they said about Saddam Hussein after Osirak in 1981, and they never recovered. Is hitting the nuclear infrastructure something that, whether it happens immediately or not, we don't know? People said, look, the reason not to do it has always been Hezbollah hitting a second strike, but Israel seems to have defanged Hezbollah. Is the idea of hitting nuclear infrastructure, in your view, realistic despite the warnings of the United States? Ray, what do you think?
The Israelis have to make a decision. In April, they conceded to the American argument that the Iranian attack should not be judged by its intent, but its logistical failure. They accepted that argument. They seem not to have accepted this time. On the nuclear issue, there's been a lot of loose talk within Iran about it's time to revise our strategic doctrine. That given the fact that Israel is not accepting international standards, Israel is not behaving the way they anticipated it would behave. They thought in the aftermath of October 7th and Rings of Fire, the international community led by the United States would impose some kind of an armistice on Israel that would spare Hamas and not essentially molest Hezbollah. They had confidence in the international community, global public opinion, and the United States to do so. Israel has not done that. It has been quite aggressive in its response, has defied that particular stricture, and to some extent that has costed in global public opinion. So right now, they have the commentary in their press today, including 34 parliamentarians that sent a letter. There was an article in Jamal newspaper, which is a Revolutionary Guard newspaper, saying we have to revise our strategic doctrine because essentially the previous assumptions we had about how Israeli power can be restricted have not come to fruition. Now, having said that, The idea that Iran will expedite and accelerate its nuclear program at this point has almost become a conventional wisdom. And every time I see conventional wisdom, I say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. It's possible that it will accelerate its nuclear activities, but I actually anticipate there'll be a diplomatic outreach to the United States about nuclear issue. There will be some sort of an outreach to the IAEA about having inspectors back. The way I think they will try to guard the nuclear program as its activities accelerate is to embed it in a diplomatic process and international inspection regime. It's hard for me to see how, if the United States and Iran are speaking about the nuclear issue, Israelis can disrupt that diplomatic dialogue by attacking it. It is hard for me to see if Hans Peter, the inspector, is running around Iran, how Israelis can disrupt that. So I actually believe what comes out of that, I don't know what the nature of the Israeli strike will be. I think if they do a limited strike on Isfahan and so forth, that will not materially affect the trajectory of the nuclear program. It will give Iranians some sort of a sanction for accelerating it. But as someone who routinely contributes to conventional wisdom and then questions it, I actually anticipate some kind of aggressive diplomatic outreach in the aftermath of the American elections.
That's my final, give you the final word, Meir. Do you share this optimistic view that from this sense of collision that we're seeing now, there could be some diplomatic way that would actually constrain Iran going forward?
No, David, I don't want to be misunderstood. I said diplomatic process, not a diplomatic outcome.
Fair enough.
And negotiation without an end, with possibility of a couple of interim agreements that mean nothing.
But you do think it could slow it down?
No, that's the point.
Okay.
That's the beauty of a diplomatic process.
Yeah, it's a big distraction.
Correct.
Good. Okay, Meir, what do you think?
I think that for the time being, and as long as Khamenei is in power, I'm not sure Iran will go all the way to the bomb. Not only the points which Ray mentioned, but I think that Khamenei understands that if Iran becomes nuclear, that will bring about a nuclear race in the Middle East. The Saudis, the Turks, and the Egyptians will become nuclear. I don't think Iran wants it. Also, I think that would cause problems for Iran with China. And therefore, Khamenei, for the time being, is cautious. The ominous sign is what Ray mentioned, is that we have now people who openly challenge this policy. They say, yes, we should become nuclear. This is something that does not happen in the past. In the past, when Khamenei said, we don't go all the way to the bomb, everyone accepted it. Now, there's open challenge, which is very problematic. At the same time, I fully agree with what Ray said, that, that Iran, Pezeshkian, and with Khamenei's permission, this which is what matters, wants to start some sort of process with the IEA.
The International Atomic Energy Agency, for our listeners.
Yeah, to ease the sanctions on Iran. And therefore, again, I doubt that Iran will rush to a bomb. Let me also say, I don't see that an Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities will be productive, will be helpful, because the Iranians have dispersed their nuclear facilities. It's deeply underground, and they can recover within a short time. It is not Iraq. Iraq never had the scientific capabilities of Iran. And, by the way, it will give the Iranians the excuse to go to a bomb. So I don't think that an Israeli attack will be productive. I think it will be counterproductive. And I agree that probably what the Ray scenario is probably the most correct one.
So I want to thank you both. I want to thank you, Meir Litvak. I want to thank you, Ray Takeyh, for really illuminating for us a very murky area, which is how Iran sees Israel and looking at different trajectories for the unfolding of this crisis. I really want to thank you both for joining us today on Decision Point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We just heard from Ray Takeyh and Meir Litvak about the deep-rooted enmity between Iran and Israel. This hostility, while central to the regime's ideological framework, has ultimately harmed the Iranian people and their economy, leading to greater international isolation and harsher sanctions. As discussed, the regime's increasing reliance on repression rather than popular legitimacy is becoming even more evident as well. Since April, a significant threshold has been shattered between Iran and Israel. Iran, long engaged in a shadow war with Israel through its Ring of Fire proxies, has now escalated dramatically by firing ballistic missiles directly at Israel on April 13th and October 1st. Israeli retaliation seems inevitable. What remains unclear is whether this signals the beginning of a new intensified military confrontation tied to Iran's nuclear ambitions, or whether some sort of diplomatic arrangement can be found. In either event, it seems like a potential harbinger of the looming dangers should Tehran succeed in advancing its power to an unimaginable level. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gaber, Simone Sadmeyer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.